Controlling Britain's debt is proving harder than anyone envisaged, so says Prime Minister David Cameron. And today his Chancellor, George Osborne, faced the scale of that challenge. Mr Osborne's autumn statement, delivered in the House of Commons, acknowledged a shortfall in the UK's deficit reduction of close to £30 billion, blowing out of the water the government's fiscal mandate to reduce the structural deficit within 5 years. Well, joining me to explain just how bad it's got is Chris Giles, the FT's economic editor. Chris, a disappointing day obviously for George Osborne. He had hoped to get rid of debt by 2014 in time for a political uptick in 2015. Sounds like he's still going to be borrowing around £80 billion then. How serious is this for the UK economy?
Well, it's clearly one of those days where the forecasts are just forecasts, but they're terrible forecasts. These are really, really bad, big changes, not just because growth is slowed now, but because the Office for Budget Responsibility, the independent fiscal watchdog, expects the recovery to be much slower into the medium term. So the problem for borrowing is it's not just going to go away as much as they had previously thought because growth will come back, but will actually be here for longer, so you have to do more action with public spending cuts and with tax increases. So not only are we not going to get rid of this current structural deficit in 2014-15 but 2016-17, so halfway through the next Parliament, but also we've seen some very big public spending cuts over and above the austerity we've already been having just to get it.
Labour obviously is saying that this is a fault, that the slow growth is a fault of these austerity cuts. Mr Osborne is pointing to problems such as turmoil in the Eurozone. Is this a result of external circumstances, or should we be pointing the finger closer to home?
Well, this is the sort of the heart of the economic debate, and if we have an independent office, and what they've said, and I'll tell you what they say, they are very much siding with Mr Osborne on this. They are not attributing the shortfall in growth to the deficit reduction programme. Of course, growth gets hit by increased taxes and lower spending, but what they're attributing it to is, first of all, increased commodity prices, pushing up inflation but not pay, secondly the Eurozone, and third, an underlying big hit to British productivity, which has just been performing appallingly over the last 3 or 4 years. We just haven't seen the productivity growth, the more you get out for every bit of labour and capital you put in. We just haven't been having it recently, and if you don't have that, you don't get good growth. Now,
the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development said that Britain's underlying borrow costs in 2013 are going to be worse in Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece. What is it that Mr Osborne's done to get us here?
Well, we have a we started with a very, very large deficit, and we now realise that our economy is not going to grow massively quickly. So even though we think we've got huge austerity, it's not as bad or not as deep as a lot of European countries are going through. So actually, our underlying deficit is still larger than all of the crisis European economies, and yet we're borrowing at very low rates. Now, Mr Osborne says this is an example of a safe haven, that people think that he's got credibility in his plans. Now, this is a very, very delicate thing. This could go at any stage. We've seen it go in not quite so safe countries, but Hungary, not in the Eurozone, has seen its borrowing costs shoot up quite recently. And so it's a very much on a knife edge, the UK economy, that while the borrowing costs are very low, partly because people believe the Bank of England will keep interest rates low for a very long time, but also because at the moment the markets think there is credibility in the government's plans for spending cuts. It's detailed, it's outlined, it's medium term, and it's not going to be very nice for people who rely on public services.
Now, another thing we learned today from the statement was a 1% cap on public sector pay. What effect is this going to have?
Well, this is where the big measure where George Osborne has cut public spending further than he previously intended to do. So we've had 2 years of public spending freezes, mostly until 2013, and then for the 2 years after that, he says the average increase will only be 1%, lower than the 2% many government departments had planned. And that, alongside then very, very tight public spending settlements penciled in, just penciled in for the time being, penciled in for 2015-16 and 2016-17, amounts to £15 billion a year cut in public spending relative to what we thought at the budget. So this is a very, very large public spending cut, 1% of GDP, another big cut. And that means that the number of public sector job losses the Office of Budget Responsibility expects to go is 710,000 now. That's a very large increase on their previous forecast. So all in all, this is not a good day for the public sector, and it comes the day before public sector strike. So you can see this will almost be red rag to a bull for public sector workers.
Igniting it all. Chris Giles, thank you very much indeed. You can get much more on the autumn statement at ft.com/autumn statement.